Yeah, so we're live. So we have a. Let me just adjust these very quick. Oh, uh, so everybody, welcome back. We have a special guest today, Dr. Paul N. Anderson, and today we're going to be talking about very important topic, which has to do with the historical Jesus, okay, and the big guy. And who doesn't want to talk about uh, uh, probably the most influential figure in the West? That would be Jesus of Nazareth. But today we're going to be talking about from a very interesting perspective, and that includes the Gospel of John. And I'm not going to steal Anderson's thunder. I will let him to talk wildly as much as possible of this, but I'm going to tease you out with this. The Gospel of John has not been included in the whole historical Jesus thing for many reasons. But there has been a project, and that project has been conducted not only by Paul, some other guys included there, Felix Just, Tom Thatcher. I can give you those names. These guys are coming up with new arguments, new perspectives, new methods, arguing that the Gospel of John needs to be included in the historical Jesus quest. And that's the topic we're going to be talking today. So, Paul, can you give us just a brief intro, who you are, your background, please, so people know who is Paul Anderson, and we're going to just go from there.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marv, and mucho gusto conocerte y también sus audiencias en el mundo latino. I grew up in South America, Medellin, Colombia, Guayaquil, Ecuador, Dominican Republic. My father was with the State Department in developing binational centers. So, Marv, I've always known that there's more than one way of looking at a problem. So, what intrigued me first about the Gospel of John is just the theological tension between the humanity and divinity of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so you have John's Christology, and so I did my PhD at Glasgow on the Christology of Jesus, or the Christology of the Gospel of John. And there I sought to understand what is the character of the origin of those tensions. So one of the things that I challenged was different theories of John's composition. A primary, I guess, program was the theory of Rudolf Bultmann, German scholar. His commentary was published in Germany 1941, then in English 1971. Arguing that John could not be written by an eyewitness, so it must be based on different sources, alien sources, not the evangelist thinking, which he used and he disagreed with, like a signs source, a Semea source, revelation sayings that were Gnostic, passion narrative. He put it together, then the redactor disagreed with him, and that's where you have the theological tension. Well, as I reviewed all of Bultmann's evidence, and I did this research at Tübingen under Otto Betz, engaging also Martin Hengel, there's no evidence for alien sources underlying the Gospel of John, using John 6 as a case study. So that became the basis for my research on John's Christology, that we have an independent, maybe even an eyewitness tradition going back to Jesus. Now, I also agreed with Bultmann and also with Peter Borgen and C.H. Dodd and D. Moody Smith and others that John is not dependent on the synoptics. When John is similar to Mark, John always is different from Mark. You have some similar phrases, but that does not suggest dependence. It might suggest some kind of other contact, maybe memory or maybe oral tradition influence, or maybe interfluence between the formative stages of Mark's and John's traditions. So 92% of John is not in Mark. And so scholars who currently are wanting to say, oh yeah, John is dependent on Mark. Well, 92% of John is not in Mark. So what do you do with those facts? And the view of dependence on
What
the
do we do with that?
yeah. So views of dependence on the synoptics actually go back to B.H. Streeter, 1924, a century ago, and Streeter is totally wrong. He builds his entire paradigm on the inference that John the Apostle died early. But when you look at the evidence for that, it's totally bogus. It's an embarrassment to critical scholarship. That Philip Sidetes and George Hamartolos, 5th century, 9th century, they say James and John were killed by the Jews, but they don't say they died at the same time. James was killed in 44 AD, but they both follow Eusebius in saying John the Apostle died in Ephesus after Domitian. Domitian died in 96. So the whole idea that John could not be written by an eyewitness because John the Apostle died early, therefore it must be a theological embellishment in Jewish and Greco-Roman ways by B.H. Streeter, which is the view that C.K. Barrett argued to some degree, and many British scholars. Well, it's totally bogus. There's no critical evidence for John the Apostle having died early. Now, we do have problems with John in that it's very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so that's why critical scholars, since David Strauss, and then also Ernst Käsemann in the first quest, and then the new quest, 1954 and following, and then the third quest, which is using new methodologies, why these first three quests have left John out, because there are real problems. And so anyway, that's what has led my own work on the fourth gospel and the quest for Jesus and the John
Yes.
History Project to try to do more balanced historical inquiry, which might include the Gospel of John.
Thank you, Paul. And with that in mind, let's hit the intro to the podcast.
Very good.
Okay. So this is getting good. I think we've been just warming up with that intro by Paul. And we're going to go with the first questions, Paul, and which is this one. Can you tell us as broad as possible? Perhaps you already talked a bit of that, but can you tell us as broad as possible how this whole project, JJH, really came about?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marv. Well, back in the year 2000, I became acquainted with Tom Thatcher, and I'd also known Felix Yost for some time. And we were aware that the Jesus Seminar, really launched in 1983, was getting some traction in the media. And they were arguing that real scholars voting on historical Jesus content have all unanimously excluded the Gospel of John from the historical quest for Jesus. And
Yep.
what they did was to contribute 2 books on the sayings of Jesus and the acts of Jesus. And they voted on every single saying and every single action. And John got no red or pink, other than that Jesus died and then that Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. That might be pink. Okay. Well, okay, that's fine. These scholars are voting. But what do you do with the fact that none of their scholars, except for Robert Fortna and maybe a few others, were really Johannine scholars? And so what they really sought to do was to establish a record of critical opinion that historical Jesus scholars, like the New Quest from Käsemann and Robinson, who said this is the New Quest, and then John Dominic Crossan said this is the renewed quest, wanting to establish what the parsimonious, reductionistic quest for Jesus have established, goes back to the historical Jesus and not theological texts. Well, what they also did was to include the Gospel of Thomas, 114 sayings, some of which may be, historical, going back to Jesus, but some of which are later Gnostic speculations. But what they wanted to do is say that's the fifth gospel, and that includes historical material more so than all the other gospels, and obviously not the Gospel of John. So I can appreciate that there may be some historical Jesus sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, but even saying 1:14, you must become a man uh, to get the kingdom of God. Well, I don't think that's historical Jesus, and so it's got a lot of problems to it as well. So what happened is that we got together and we met with George Eldon Epp, and at the Nashville SBL meetings in the year 2000, and we just said, hey, how about if we do a historical critical inquiry on these three problematic subjects: Gospel of John, um, historical Jesus of Nazareth, and historicity. So,
Yeah.
how about if we propose a consultation for the national meetings, John, Jesus, and history, invite top scholars from all over the world to present something and argue whatever you want, but just argue the degree to which your argument is plausible and then why it is plausible. So that began the John Jason History Project. Our first 3 years were as a consultation, one meeting or one session every year. And then we did uh, uh, further meetings for the next two triennia. Now, let me just say suggest the way that we argue things. One of my early essays sort of did an analysis of here are the platforms of critical scholarship on John, Jesus, and history. And so what I did was to privilege the critical skeptical views.
Yeah.
One is that there's no history in John. John is theological and different, therefore no history. Okay, fine. How do we know that? And so platform number one, with 6 planks in the platform, are the dehistoricization of John. If John begins with the Christ hymn as the prologue, and the narrator is highly theological in his interest, therefore, yes, John is theological. Therefore, there's nothing historical in John. Well, how strong is that? And so when you look at 6 planks, it's got a lot of problems. John has a
Yeah.
lot of main material. It's later, yes, but that doesn't mean it's not historical. Sometimes a later historical project will be correcting earlier histories. And so none of those planks are solid. Here's the second plank or the second platform: the de-Johannification of Jesus. If it's in John, it cannot go back to Jesus. Fine, go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
But how strong is that? What if we have Jesus going to and from Jerusalem? In John, he does that 4 times or 5 times. Well, that seems more historically plausible than one visit to Jerusalem and then they kill Jesus, and he never went to Jerusalem before that. Well, I
Yeah.
think John's is more historically plausible. On the other hand, we all think that the historical Jesus spoke in parables. John has no parables. Okay, so we'll privilege the synoptics there, but that doesn't mean that none of the sayings of Jesus in John go back to the historical Jesus, even if we have a theological embellishment. So the de-Johannification of Jesus, which also is demonstrated in the Jesus seminar, where
Mm.
where you have the healing of a person in Capernaum from afar. Well, that's in Matthew and Luke, but in their case, it's it's the servant of a centurion. In John, it's the royal official's son. Well, you have corroborative impression then, but goodness, should we therefore say that the Q tradition is not historical? What really turned my thinking on this is the fact that the saying of Jesus in Matthew 11 and Luke 10, none knows the Father but the Son, like the
Mhm.
father-son relationship, that's very Johannine. It's throughout the Gospel of John, but it's also in Q if there was a Q. Now, where the
Yeah.
Jesus
If
seminar,
there was a few.
exactly. Now, where the
Yeah.
Jesus seminar had privileged Q over Matthew and over Luke and over Mark, here they kicked it out because it looked like John. And so if it looks like John, if it smells, sounds, feels, tastes like John, kick it out of the synoptics and also the Gospel of Thomas, because, and even Q, if it seems
Yeah.
like John. So, frankly, that may be overdone as a criterion. So, we developed our first set of projects on, hey, let's have 5 literature reviews, the de-Johanification of Jesus, uh, and the dehistoricization of John. How strong is that? You may
Yeah.
have a theological interest in the way the fourth evangelist is developing a story, but does that mean it's not historical? And then Paula Frederickson did a nice essay for us as a case study. Notice that while Jesus is in the synoptics, Jesus, the temple cleansing happens
Hmm.
after his final visit to Jerusalem. Notice that they don't arrest Jesus right away in the
No.
synoptics. And so
Hmm.
even if that was offensive, they don't arrest him right away. And notice also that you have the royal officials not being offended by Jesus in the synoptics and also in John. Why? Because they'd seen Jesus already. He'd been there before. Jesus was not a problem. And so you have maybe the early temple incident in John as perhaps being more plausible chronologically, and that might suggest that Mark is just stacking everything up at the very end. Well, John's
Yeah.
chronology might be superior to that of the synoptics, and Mark Allen Powell responded to that. So anyway, that was our first volume. Now, let me just say something about what we did then for volumes 2 and 3.
Yeah.
So if the first platform is the dehistoricization of John, are there aspects of historicity in the Gospel of John? And so we have 24 or more papers on aspects of historicity in John. And then, so that's volume 2. And then volume 3 is glimpses of Jesus through the Johannine lens. So how does the Gospel of John help us see aspects of Jesus through the Gospel of John? And so those 2 volumes challenge platform 1 and platform 2 of critical scholars. So these are the 2 critical planks of critical scholars over the last century and a half. But when you look at these platforms and their planks critically, they are totally insufficient critically. So that was the first 9 years of the John Jesuit History Project.
There you go. Thank you for that. I mean, what can I say as a layman here? Because Paul, that's the traditional argument that I've been familiar with, is that the John has nothing to do. It's just theological. There's no history here, so keep moving, citizens. and and that's to some point. I think that that's what I've been hearing much about. That John has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. It's more of a theological document per se. But with this project, you are coming on to the front and with new perspectives, new methods, new arguments, new evidence. Can we say that? That the John has to be included in the fourth quest, because yeah, we have, okay, some might say, I don't know what you think about this, Paul, but some might say we got the first, second, and third quest. But some might say, and I read this from James Crossley in the new book coming out. Well, it's already out there. The new quest for the historical Jesus, edited by him and Chris Keith. And he said that some might even make the case that we don't even know exactly the number of quests, but the three quests, the first 3 quests, are just the one that we know about, to say just like that. So I don't know what you think about that, but again, John, I have many questions about John. For example, you read the synoptic gospels, you can see the exorcisms, what happened with the demons being expulsed from the people who is afflicted. There's no exorcisms in John. I mean, what happened there? I don't know. I don't know, what is your take. This is more of a sidebar question to you, since you are a Johannine scholar. What do you think? What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I encourage people to look at my introduction to John. It's called Riddles of the Fourth Gospel.
Okay.
There, I lay out a dozen theological tensions, a dozen historical problems, and a dozen literary problems. So 36 riddles. And then I list 12 theories of composition, strength and weaknesses. Then I list my own theory, which is John's dialogical autonomy. And then in chapter 7, I show how what the origin of each of those riddles is. So on John's historical riddles, two of those are John's. Oh, there we
You
go.
mean this one, right?
Yeah, that's it. And I use that on an undergraduate level and also a
Okay.
graduate level in my classes. So two problems are content in the synoptics not included in John. That's a real problem.
Yeah.
John's Jesus does not speak in parables. I think that the synoptics are superior there. Um, John's the synoptic Jesus casts out demons. John's Jesus does not. But notice that in Mark and in Luke, you have a disciple who questions whether exorcists should be silenced. And
Yeah.
Jesus says, no, don't silence them. They're casting out demons in my name. If they're not against us, they're for us. Who is that disciple? It's John the Apostle.
Hmm.
Maybe we have an opinion by someone who is not all that happy with exorcisms. Or
Yeah.
another more realistic possibility is that whoever is finalizing the Gospel of John, hey, that's already out there. He already knows of Mark. But if you're finalizing the story of Jesus in Asia Minor, post 70 Jerusalem, or post 70 Asia Minor, then maybe those audiences are not interested in exorcisms. So, for whatever reason, the evangelist is selective. If he knows Mark, maybe he leaves out stuff precisely because it is in Mark. Okay,
Sure.
so yeah, that's a problem. And also, you have healings and other stuff that's in Mark. But you also have, and so here I'm going to allude to my theory of John's composition. It seems like we have more than one edition. So, like chapter 21 is probably added later. We have the Christ hymn um, in John's prologue. Actually, I'm calling it John's overture. Um,
Hmm.
it seems
Really?
it seems like it seemed
Yeah.
like the overture is the last thing that you write
The
when
last, yeah.
finalizing a Broadway musical or a movie. And so it's very similar to 1 John 1 1 to 3, written by John the Elder. So if John the Elder and the Johannine community affirms the teaching of the beloved disciple, even after he has passed away, just never said he wouldn't die, and you have three stanzas that are packaged around John the Baptist references, John 1, 6, 7, and 8, John 1, 15, John 1, 19 to 42, then you have three stanzas that are like 1 John 1 1 to 3 that reflects the community's affirmation of the beloved disciples' teaching. And therefore, it's an engaging, transformative introduction to the narrative, but it is not the first stroke of the quill. It is not what is written first before telling John's story of Jesus.
Yeah.
Rather, John's story. So that is a critical mistake that scholars make um, in assuming that because the narrative, the finalized narrative, begins with a confession, therefore, which is theological. Yes, of course, it's theological, but therefore, nothing in the narrative is historical. Furthermore, the Christ hymn affirms the flesh of Jesus. That in the flesh of Jesus we encountered His glory. The Word
Yeah.
become flesh, and within that is the glory of God encountered. So the beginning of John is more like an echo of Mark. So, yeah, Mark begins John the Baptist, and he came testifying to Jesus, John 1, 6, and 7, but he's not the light. Jesus is the light. And he was Jesus, he was before Jesus, although Jesus came after him, but Jesus was before him in terms of ontological, precedence.
Yeah.
And when they come to John in verses 19 through 21, are you the Messiah? He says, no, I'm not. Jesus is. Are you the prophet like Moses? No, no, Jesus is. Oh, are you Elijah? No, Jesus is.
Are you?
So,
Are you?
well, and so that's disagreement with Mark,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
for Mark, Jesus even says Elijah came and you rejected him. And so here we have John the Baptist saying, I'm not Elijah, Jesus is, disagreeing with Mark. So I think we have an eyewitness tradition, and one of its interests is, first of all, not duplicating Mark,
Yeah.
secondly, adding to Mark, and thirdly, correcting Mark because Mark got it wrong from day one. And so you have an eyewitness memory that's saying Mark is pretty good, but here's another story. So you also have Mark 1:14. After John was imprisoned, Jesus came ministering. No, no, no. John 3:24. Before John was thrown into prison, look at all these things that happened. Sign number one, sign number two. So the first two miracles are included to correct the Gospel of Mark, saying that Jesus did miracles before John was thrown into prison. Mark got it wrong from day one. Now, that might offend some conservatives. I don't care. I'm just being
Yeah.
a hard-nosed critic. But it also may confound critical scholars who say, oh,
Mhm.
there's nothing historical in John because it begins with the Christ hymn. Come on, the Christ hymn is added later. And so that basis for excluding John's historicity is totally bogus critically. And critical scholars need to accept that and to be more balanced in their looking at gospel traditions. So if we think about the first edition of John, maybe it's the second gospel, although it's not circulated.
Yeah.
We have no evidence that it was circulated, but if it was finalized after the death of the beloved disciple, John the Apostle, one of the sons of Zebedee, John 21, verse 2, then you have also a corrective to Mark 9:1. Peter got it wrong from day one. So you have Jesus in Mark 9:1. There are people standing here on the Mount of Transfiguration, James, John, and Peter, who will not taste death till they see the Son of God, to see the kingdom of God coming in all of its glory. Because of this, the rumor spread that this disciple, it must be John the Apostle, would not die. But Jesus never said that. Peter got it wrong from day one. The delay
Yeah.
was never a problem for the Johannine community. And so that affirms both Peter's preaching underlying the Gospel of Mark, which is the traditional view that John Mark, follower of Paul, gathered Peter's preaching. And so John Mark was not an eyewitness. He's gathering at least some of Peter's preaching. So he stacks it together in a general chronology, but it's not a knowing chronology. You have the beginning, middle, and end, but Mark stacks all the Jerusalem stuff at the very end, okay, because it makes a big ending. But John's presentation is to say, no, 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 no. We have Jesus visiting Jerusalem several times, not just one. We have 3 Passovers, not just one. You have a temple incident early, along with John the Baptist and his provocative eschatological prophetic ministry. And so an early temple incident, and they want to kill Jesus already in John 5, and then they still want to kill him in John 7 and later on. And so John's presentation, I think, presents a more realistic itinerary of Jesus, as opposed to just one visit to Jerusalem and then they kill him. Now, of course, Matthew and Luke are following Mark. And so it's
Sure.
not just John against three traditions, although Matthew's tradition and Luke's tradition also corroborates what's in Mark. But we have basically John and Mark as two different perspectives from day one. This is why I call them the bioptic gospels.
Bioptic, yeah.
Matthew and Luke build upon Mark, John builds around Mark, is different on purpose. And so with Richard Bauckham, that the Gospel of John is then finalized and circulated for readers and hearers of Mark. Yeah, here's an augmentation of Mark and a pushback. And then you have the later, okay, so I think the later material, and this is the Anderson composition theory.
Thank
Now,
you.
in John, Jesus, and History, we also did not expect people to come together with one view. We said, hey, whatever your view is, put it out there. So I'm putting out my own theory, a bioptic hypothesis.
Yeah.
And if people don't agree with it, fine. But tell me, what is more plausible. And so we invite all perspectives. But this is my theory that later material, siding with Barnabas Linders and John Ashton, came to agree with me after my conversation with him in Göttingen in 1987, I think. Then I published this later in my Christology in 1996, and then
with more civic,
with more
unity
civic,
and disunity,
and then which went through two more editions. In 2010, I give an overall Johannine theory as the introduction, and I respond also to reviews.
Yeah.
So I think the later material includes chapter 21, the Christ hymn, John 6, and so 5 and 7 are kind of together. John 6 gets added later, and then 15, 16, and 17 are added later. So 14:31, let us depart, they get to the garden in 18:1. Now, if that's the case, here's what we have. The first edition of John has 5 miracles, not 8. These are the 5 miracles not in Mark. It's an augmentation. Yeah. It's supplementing Mark. Yeah. Here's number 1 and number 2 before Mark 1. Thank you very much. And Matthew 18, Matthew agrees with John. Or, whether Matthew knows of John, Matthew corroborates John. And so you have the healing in Capernaum from afar before the miracles done in Capernaum in Mark chapter 1. Matthew also corroborates John on the geographical miracles of Jesus. So John augments. So in the synoptics, Jesus does no miracles in Jerusalem or in Bethany. John has 3 miracles in Jerusalem and Bethany. You have the invalid by the pool, the blind man by the other pool, Siloam, and then the raising of Lazarus. So if John knows of Mark, John augments Mark geographically with 3 Judean miracles as well as 2 early miracles. Now, Matthew 21:14, the miracles Jesus did in the temple area on the blind people and the lame people. Does Matthew know John? I don't know, but Matthew corroborates John's independent witness. So I think that's corroborative impression. And so instead of saying, oh, there's nothing historical in John because it's different, Matthew will disagree with you. Furthermore, Luke will depart from Mark 6 dozen times in Johannine directions. So Luke adds little details like the right ear is cut off. Satan enters Judas. It's on the transfiguration. They beheld his glory. It's 1 feeding, not 2. And Luke moves the confession of Peter to the other feeding, like it is in John. So Luke, I then harmonizes John and Mark. In Mark, the confession of Peter is, "You are the Christ." In Luke, it's in John, it's "Holy One of God." With the words of the demoniac in Mark 1:24. And so if Peter is talking about Holy One of God as a miracle man, maybe Peter did say, "Holy One of God, you're a miracle man," instead of "You are the Christ." I mean, that might reflect the historical Peter in John 6. I'm just saying that coheres with Mark 1:24. If Mark's tradition goes back to Peter, that's what Peter says in John 6. But I don't think that suggests that Peter is a demoniac. I think that suggests that Peter is saying, hey, miracle man, we don't have to suffer, do we? And Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. Oh, no, that's Mark. But he says, one of you is a devil. Okay, you're doing the works of the devil. And the redactor says, oh, he can't mean Peter. He must have meant Judas. But here we have the escape of the way of the cross. And so the content here is you must be willing to suffer and die with Jesus. You must eat my flesh and drink my blood. It's not saying take the Eucharist or be damned. It's saying you must be willing to suffer and die with Jesus. His flesh given for the life of the world on the cross. That is your bread. So don't deny Jesus or his community when under Domitian. You will face persecution and maybe martyrdom unless you deny Jesus and his community. So I think that these are ways that, so Luke, he harmonizes Mark and John, the Christ, Holy One of God. You're the Christ of God. Now Luke also makes some strange moves in John's directions. He moves a head anointing to a foot anointing, like it is in John, and so he departs from Mark. If he has a historical reason, well, that's in the Gospel of John. He then, in the next paragraph, in Luke 8, he adds Mary Magdalene in 8:2. Well, maybe he hears the name Mary and Martha, and he thinks it's the other Mary. So Luke then adds Mary and Martha, doing in Luke 10. And that coheres with John 11 and 12, Mary and Martha. Luke adds a dead man, Lazarus, but now it's a parable. Oh, Luke adds a great catch of fish. That's only in John. So I think that Luke has access to John's content, and he adds material and details that are in John, and he prefers John's content over Mark at least 6 dozen times. So I think that Luke believes that John's narrative is historically more plausible than Mark, at least in some ways. So these are ways that I think that Luke and Matthew corroborate John's historicity over and against Mark.
Okay, thank you for that. Oh my goodness, there's a lot to talk here. I just want to. Oh, you were about to say something?
A lot of fun.
I mean, this is, as always, I say, scholars trying to, synthesize, summarize bullet points. It takes an effort. So thank you for that. I mean, there's a lot of books. You can see, for example, we have the first volume here, John, Jesus, and the History, which is the subtitled Critical Appraisals of Critical Views. I like that. Why the critical views can be critical analyzed? Yes, they can and should. So that was the first volume. What year was this one, Paul?
That was 2007 that it was published.
It's been a while. Then we have the second volume, which is the John, Jesus, and History, Aspects of Historicity in the Fourth Gospel. Okay. The third volume, Glimpses of Jesus through the Johannine Lens. And finally, the most recent volume is Jesus Remembered in the Johannine Situation. Okay. It's a lot of, it's a project, it's a whole project. Paul shared with me a link. It needs to be updated, but in that link, I put it right there under the notes. You can go to the notes of this video and you can check the many information about this project and how it has been developing ever since. So there you go. Now, Paul, there's something I want to show you. Okay. And this is the origin, how I got to be familiar with your scholarship. And I'm not sure if you remember this, but this was on a Facebook post, and I left a comment there, and I share with you how did I come to know about your scholarship. So I wanna play a clip. Okay, I have the clip here. How that happened, because it's very. I just wanna remind about that. Give me just a moment, because I was watching this debate between Bud Ehrman and Craig Evans, and they were debating how on the reliability of the Gospels, the never-ending topic, how reliable can the Gospels be? So they were debating, and they were in the Q&A. Imagine that they were going back and forth, and I love that both scholars were very respectful to each other, which is awesome. I don't like debates when they go with what do you call it, ad hominem attacks. I don't like that. I think that doesn't have that. It shouldn't have a place in academia. But this was a very respectful debate. Of course, they didn't agree on everything, and this is the part that I want to show you. Just let me play it right here. Let me know if you can listen to the clip, Paul, so I can play it right here.
Yep, it's good.
So, can you hear it?
Yeah.
Okay, let's play it.
In the Gospel of John, Jesus says a lot of I am sayings, very famous sayings. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, etc. These I am sayings. And at one point, of course, he says, the Father and I are one. So my question to you is, do you think the historical Jesus really said these things?
I think most of these things were not uttered.
Okay, I just want to pause it right here. Paul, you brought up the Jesus seminar. What, to my understanding, Jesus seminar guys, they were like making sure what are those sayings that have historical value, that really, this is probably the historical Jesus said this and that. That was part of the the Jesus seminar. They were doing that kind of job, like highlighting what possibly the historical Jesus said. And this is something that Bart is bringing up. I mean, almost all the debates that I watch about Bart Ehrman, he almost always, not always, but almost always, he brings up that argument about the sayings, what is possible that the historical Jesus might have said. So do you think the Jesus seminar really made a contribution to the academia, to the scholarship, in terms of making sure what the historical Jesus have said or not?
Well, this is nothing new. Scholars have, this is a real problem. If Jesus really said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd. Why are these sayings not in the synoptics? That's a real problem. On the other hand, each of those 9 metaphors or themes are uttered by Jesus of the synoptics. You have, even in Q, you have the shepherd looking for sheep. Well, John says, yeah, and Jesus is the shepherd. You have Matthew saying, you are the light of the world to his followers. Well, John's Jesus says, I am the light of the world. So on the basis of Matthew, you cannot say Jesus never said light of the world. What we do have is John's appropriation of Jesus' language to his teachings about Jesus. So here I might agree with Bart and also the critics that we probably have the evangelist speaking here rather than Jesus of Nazareth.
Oh.
So this is an example of, I think,
That's new to me.
The evangelist. Well, it's the evangelist theologizing in the way he tells stories, or in the way he tells his memory of Jesus. But you cannot say Jesus never said bread. You cannot say Jesus never said resurrection or life or shepherd. You cannot say that Jesus never said vineyard. Okay, you have a parable of the vineyard where they reject the son. Now, and so what I think is going on here is, and so here I'm going to be critically of overly conservative quotings of Jesus in the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
I think and I've written a whole essay on this of the I am sayings, the ego eimi sayings
Ego eimi. Yeah.
in cognitive critical perspective. And so somebody who hears Jesus say, ego eimi, me phobeste, I am, fear not. I think that this is what Jesus says in Mark 6 and John 6. Maybe we have two disciples in the boat. I am, fear not. Or is it is I, fear not? Now, here's where we have, I think, Mark 6, or the source of Mark's memory, as reflecting an epiphany, not a theophany. So in Mark 6, they see Jesus. Oh my goodness, he's a ghost,
Yeah.
phantasm. He's going to float by the boat. And he says, ego eimi me phobeste. Oh, thank goodness, is little old Jesus not a ghost? And they receive him into the boat. Whereas another disciple, what if we have two different perspectives from day one? Seeing Jesus, he's walking along the shore, along the sea, maybe not even walking on the water, walking walking along the sea, and the boat immediately gets to the land. So in that sense, John's sea crossing is less miraculous. He's walking along the shore or along the sea, gets the boat, and he says, "Ego eimi me phobeste, I am, fear not." So what if one of the disciples, under his breath, says, and I apologize for strong language, I'm quoting Peter here, "Ego eimi me phobeste, my God, it's a ghost." Oh, and Peter swears later on. Okay.
Yeah.
My God, it's a ghost. But
I
what
can
if
say it for you.
Peter said that, not me?
Okay.
Strong language.
Okay.
But maybe, what if another disciple associates it with Exodus 3:14, my Lord and my God,
Yeah.
and experiences as a theophany, and they received him into the boat, and the boat gets to the shore. Now, here's another fact. You cannot say that Jesus of Nazareth, based upon the synoptics, never sighted burning bush. In Mark 12, Jesus says, God said to Moses before the burning bush at the trial, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, before the burning bush. So you cannot say that Jesus never cited Exodus 3 in relation to God and burning bush. And so, okay, maybe we also have an appropriation of that to
Yeah.
affirm Jesus's authority in John 8. Before Abraham was, ego eimi, I am. And what do? They pick up stones to kill him. So this
Yep.
is as blasphemy. So I'm happy to see historical memory of historical Jesus and some of his sayings supported corroboratively in the synoptics, which are appropriated in John's memory of Jesus, even if it's embellished. So it's embellished history as opposed to non-history. And yeah.
Paul, just to break in here, is that what you guys scholars call that's what when you're doing theologizing history?
So that's how.
Well, that's different.
That's how I would see John's historical memory as theologized.
Okay.
But it's not divorced from history. It's the theologizing of historical memory.
And that's the thing with the skeptics. I remember I won't say, I can say the name privately to you, but there's a big guy there who is a very skeptic. He's a scholar, but he is probably the champion of skepticism. It's not Barr, because Bart Ehrman, he's an atheist, agnostic, whatever, but at least he's honest enough to recognize that Jesus was a historical figure. So that's fine. We're doing okay there. But there's this guy who really takes no theology as a history because, in my appreciation, he is inputting a lot of modern concepts, biases into that term, history, that most likely ancient people didn't have at all. So that's anachronistic in my view. So, and that's what my mentor, Michael Heiser, used to say. He was talking about the Exodus. He was doing the Exodus series. And most of the people, there was no Exodus. That's just fantasy, whatever. Okay, glad. 5 points. And he used to say, well, what about the author, the writer of Exodus? He is the editor or whatever. He is theologizing history. This is an event that really took place in the past, perhaps many years from the moment that it was putting into as a writing. But it is just theology working through, or history working through theology. And that's fine. That happens. So we can just go out there and throw the whole baby out with the bathwater completely. No, we just need to be very careful not to impose our modern preconceptions on ancient texts. I don't know what would you say to that, Paul? Am I right? Am I hitting there, or am I missing something? Anything?
Well, yes, and that's what the Jesus Seminar sought to establish. So Robert Funk wanted to be sure that everybody knows that real scholars have come to see John as not historical, and therefore out of bounds for historical Jesus research. John Dominic Crossan, and I don't know if that's the name that you're referring to, but he also went with that. And times that I met, and times that I met John Dominic, I've said,
he's a good guy. I love it.
Yeah. Said, what do you think about this? He said, oh no, there's nothing historical. I said, well, how do you know that? And he refused to answer me. But his friend and my friend Marcus Borg, he and I have had a better relationship. In 2010, at the Reedwood Center for Christian Studies, they sponsored a public dialogue between myself and Marcus Borg, which was Jesus in Bioptic Perspective. And we had 3 sessions where Marcus presented on the synoptics, I presented on John. So we did the acts of Jesus, then the words of Jesus, and then the passion narrative in the synoptics and John. And so Marcus presented, here's a synoptic perspective. I presented, here's a Johannine perspective. And we had discussion. It was really a lot of fun. I tried to get Marcus to co-author a book with me on that, but he was toward the end of his life, and he didn't, have an interest in doing that.
Yeah,
but
that's unfortunate.
But after our first set of papers in the discussion, he said to me, "Okay, Paul, this whole thing about John Jesus in history and historical Jesus and John, why is this significant? Is there anything new that gets offered, or is it just that Jesus went to Jerusalem several times instead of one?" So my response was this, and I've also written an essay on that, on the Bible and interpretation, and so I can send you that link. But I say, well, first of all, I don't care. I just think that if you're going to do historiography that's adequate, if you're going to do if you're going to use a 2nd and 3rd century Gnostic text, how can you not include John? That's my concern. And I don't care where it leads. I think people just need to find a way to use the Gospel of John critically, as well as critically challenging other views. That's all. Yeah, this is what good historiography does, instead of imbalanced or critically inadequate historiography on the most significant figure of Jesus, most significant figure of history, which is Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah. And so, first of all, I don't care. I think people just find a way to use John adequately as a historical source, as well as a theological source. And likewise, synoptics as theological. And I mean, Mark is theological also, and so is Matthew and Luke. But I said, what I do think is interesting, though, is that the Gospel of John includes women in relationship to Jesus.
Yeah.
The woman at the well is the apostle to the Samaritans. Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostles. The mother of Jesus opens and closes the whole narrative. And I think that represents
Mhm.
a pushback against male hierarchy in the late first century situation, where you have a monopiscopal tradition developing with Ignatius appropriating a Matthean Petrine
You mean
ecclesiology.
Abraham Malharby? Is
No, no,
this,
no.
is this it?
Um,
No. Oh,
Ignatius of Antioch is pushing back against. Well, yeah, I'm disagreeing with Malherbe.
okay, okay.
That Malherbe sees Diotrephes, who loves to be first, as nothing big here. It's just hospitality. I'm saying no. Malherbe got it wrong, and I mean, Abe and I have discussions about this also. Uh, Here, I agree with Harnack and with Casamon that Diotrephes was a proto-Ignatian hierarchical leader who is keeping John's Christians out of his church. And a conversation I had with Ernst Casamon, I mean, I need to write these things up. Conversation
You
that
talked with Ernst Caseman?
was that
You ha- did you talk with Ernst Caseman in the flesh or
in correspondence.
oh,
Um,
oh, oh, okay, no, that's
um,
yeah, I
Casamon,
wish I could.
yeah, and I also published Casamon's book, Testament of Jesus, in the Johannine Monograph series, and I had
Okay.
an introduction to it. So in my correspondence with Casamon, my first letter asked, why do you think Diotrephes was threatened by Johannine traveling ministers? Casamon thought that Diotrephes was threatened by their naive Docetism and their heresy. What I asked is, what might he have been threatened by their egalitarian ecclesiology, including women in ministry? And he,
Oh,
and he wrote back and said, "Es ist nicht aus der Luft gegriffen." That's not entirely grabbed out of the air.
let's throw some German in there.
Yeah. And so, as I think about this, oh, and this is my essay in
Sure.
JJH4 on Diotrephes, which is just published in October 2024, where I think that the whole reason that the elder publishes the work of John the Apostle is to push back against Petrine hierarchy, and to
Hmm.
say that, and so Peter, and this is my book on John's Christology, Peter's confession, you have the eternal life, it returns the keys of the kingdom back to Jesus. Instead of Jesus giving Peter, Matthew 16, instrumental keys to establish whatever established on earth as it is in heaven, then Matthew 18. Notice that Matthew has Peter being asked to forgive 7 times 70. And
Yeah.
so in tradition, Petrine hierarchy is also gracious and forgiving. But all it takes is one leader like Diotrephes, who is philoproteron, primacy loving, and Matthew 10:2, Jesus appoints Peter first, protos, of the apostles, of the disciples. And so Diotrephes, who loves primacy, is excluding John's Christians from his church because they have an egalitarian ecclesiology and the Holy Spirit is available to everybody, not just the hierarchy and women in leadership and all that stuff. And so I'm arguing that we have the Gospel of John as a pushback against house codes and only having men in leadership, and then Petrine hierarchy as putting forth a more primitive understanding of Jesus's intentionality for the church. And so I'm saying to Marcus Borg, I think that might be interesting. That might be highly relevant for historical Jesus studies. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, let's go back to the clip because I want you to see that part where Craig Evans
Oh, good. Yeah.
brings your name up
Uh,
because yeah, that's the whole point of this video clip.
Craig's very bright. Craig's very bright.
Yeah.
So
That's so smart.
I suspect we don't have too much difference on John. My view is the Gospel of John is a horse of another color altogether. It's a different genre.
Oh wow.
John is often
compared to the wisdom literature. It's like wisdom is personified.
Chokmah.
Chokmah, Lady
Mhm.
Wisdom, or in Greek, Sophia. She wanders the streets. She calls out to people. She does things. Well, nobody would read that and think, oh, did you see wisdom going down the street the other day? Nobody would think that as a literal person. What is mysterious to me about John is that once you say that, say, okay, perhaps we should interpret the I am statements as he is confessions. He is the light of the world. He is the way, truth, and the life. He is the bread of life. Confession of the Johannine community that likely generated that version of the gospel. About the time you think John is a gigantic parable, then along comes a scholar who says, it's loaded with historical details also. And so that's what makes John so tricky. There is a Society of Biblical Literature section devoted to John and the historical Jesus, chaired by a scholar named Paul Anderson. So,
okay, wait a minute. That was the moment I say, okay, who is Paul Anderson? Because I mean, they're just talking there. Craig is just answering the question, and all of a sudden he throws your name out there, and I was like, who is Paul Anderson? And it's that in Society of Biblical Literature, SBL. Then I moved to Facebook and I typed Paul Anderson, and then your picture came up, and then I just checked the friends, and I said to myself, this must be the guy. Click. And yeah, I was right. You were the guy. You were the Paul Anderson, and that's how I got to know a bit of who you were and what you were doing in the scholarship. And yeah, that's how the whole thing came up. So, Paul, what do you think if we can move on to the second question, because we want to value your time? Okay.
Very good.
All right. So, question number 2, Paul, in what ways does this new volume differ from the others, and what are the expectations for those reading through it?
Thanks, Marv. And let me say something first about Craig
Sure.
Evans. A volume that is in press right now. I turned it in 5 years ago, and it had over 100 photos. And so it's taken Erdmans a long time to get it all going, getting all the permissions. But it's on archaeology, John and Jesus. And Craig Evans wrote the final essay about the entire volume. And he's saying that we have here in John verisimilitude, which is similarity with Palestine culture that is totally different from the 2nd and 3rd century apocryphal gospels. And so John is not like those gospels, but John is also not like the synoptics, because John has more archaeologically attested and topographical details than all the other gospels combined, canonical and non-canonical. And so this reflects John Jason History project since 2010, where I literally drew in top archaeologists around the world and said, could you do something on archaeology, John and Jesus? Argue whatever you want, but let's do something on this. So we have over 24 huge essays on the mundane Jesus. And that's my opening essay. The mundane Jesus. So, highly theological, yes. Also totally mundane, more mundane than the synoptics, with all these details. So what do critical scholars do with these facts? And so anyway, Craig Evans wrote the response to that. Now, let me just describe what happened with JJH. So we did 9 years, and then we did 2 more triennia. So 15 years total. And then we called it quits and said, that's enough. We got a whole lot of stuff. And so in addition to the central series, we did 5, and then 6 is in process, 5 additional volumes. So the first one, edited by Tom Thatcher and Mary Callow, was on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of John. And I wrote a big essay on 60 Years Remembered. Then Catherine Williams and Tom Thatcher on reading the Gospel of John with C.H. Dodd. It's a wonderful essay, C.H. Dodd and Raymond Brown. These essays were then reviewed at St. Mary's Theological Seminary, where Raymond Brown taught, along with Michael Gorman, back in 2013. And so Yeah. So how do we think about historical tradition in the Gospel of John? A third volume was put together by Alan Culpepper and myself on on Jesus Remembered and the Johannine epistles. So what do we do with the epistles and the Gospel of John? And so we had essays on that, and I critiqued Raymond Brown's theory of the Johannine community. Here's where I agree with Ray. Here's where I disagree with Ray.
Yeah.
Then the fourth volume, Alan Culpepper and myself, on John and Judaism. Is John pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish? My thesis is John is pro-Jewish. We have an intra-faith set of debates, not an interreligious set of polemics. And so it's highly Jewish, and Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. Then a fifth volume, edited and gathered by Craig Kester, on portraits of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And here I built on Marcus Borg's work that you have 4 portraitures of Jesus. This goes back to my earlier essay on why this study is needed and why it's needed now on planks and platforms.
Okay.
And so one of those platforms is, or one of those planks is, we have 5 views of Jesus, if we include Bart Ehrman's apocalyptic Jesus, wisdom, prophet, sage, a holy person, and then apocalyptic. My view on that, clear back.
Tell us your view.
Clear back in 2006 and 2007, because it's in my book on the fourth gospel and the quest for Jesus. So I use it in both places.
Thank you.
You have each of these more clear in the Gospel of John than the synoptics.
Okay.
So John, Jesus is a wisdom sage. He is a holy person. He is an eschatological prophet. He is apocalyptic. You have each of these clearer in the Gospel of John than in the synoptics. And so Craig Kester, he drew in different essays on portraits of Jesus in the Gospel of John. So the 6th volume, which has not been published until next year, maybe the end of 2025 or early 2026, is on archaeology, John and Jesus. So those are a total of 6 volumes beyond the central series, but we have 4 more volumes in the central series, and for a total of 7 over the next 3 years. So what we did then is to work with Jimmy Dunn's language of Jesus remembered. Instead of historical Jesus, well, how about memory of Jesus, which is historical, even if it's developed theologically? Okay. So 3 of our volumes, last year, this year, and then next year, are on Jesus remembered. So in Johannine, so here's where I think this project contributes to historical Jesus studies and also synoptic studies, and also Johannine studies. So volume 4, getting to your question now.
Not a problem.
There we go. Well, it's a long way into it. But Jesus remembered in the Johannine situation. So J. Lewis Martin and Raymond Brown argued that we have history and theology in the Johannine community. Well, it's not just one community. Now, Brown said it's at least one community, but also Brown also said there are several communities. And so I'm calling it situation, not community.
Yeah.
Now, here's where Lou Martin, my friend who is deceased, and also Raymond Brown, my friend who is deceased. And I just love these people.
Lou Martin, you mean the one who wrote the Galatians commentary? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, his work on Galatians is wonderful. And when I taught at Yale Divinity School over 25 years ago.
You were at Yale Divinity School?
Yeah.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I taught there for 1 year.
Wow.
The dean, Richard Wood, was a friend of mine, and he encouraged Harry Attridge to
that's good to know.
Check on my availability, and it worked out for me to teach. So when we arrived at Yale, Dick Wood organized a lunch with Lou Martin at the Yale Faculty Club at Maury's Restaurant. So we're just comparing notes and everything. But Lou had been working with his doctoral student's hypothesis, Robert Fortna, at Union, on a signs gospel. And so what Fortna did was kind of to combine Bultmann's Timaeus source and Passion's source into a signs gospel. And he argued this was the early Johannine tradition, which the evangelists then theologized and added theological content. And that's why you have tensions with the Jews, because you have in the discourses, you have anti-Jewish rhetoric. And so it's history, which is the signs gospel, and then theology, which is the evangelist work. And so Lou said, the epistles of John, nothing to do with the signs gospel or the evangelist. And so what we really have is we have the aposynagogos out of the synagogue. And so we have 9:22, 12:42, 16:2, even back then kicked out of the synagogue. And so you have the Gospel of John as finalized as a way of saying Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah, despite us getting kicked out of the synagogue.
Okay.
Now, I think that's one issue, but it's not the only issue. And so here we need to look at a larger perspective on Jesus remembered in the Johannine situation over 7 decades, not just one. And so we have early 30 to 70 situation where you have a history of tensions between the religious leaders in Jerusalem and the Galilean prophet and his followers. So the Judaioi are not necessarily the Jews. The Judaioi may be the Judeans who are opposing the Galilean prophet. You also have tensions with followers of John the Baptist, but these are friendly competitions. And he pointed to Jesus. John's not the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah.
Okay.
Then you have a move to Asia Minor, and there we have tensions with a synagogue. Yes, this is like 70 to 85 or 90, but you also have tensions with the Roman imperial cult under Domitian. So 81 to 96, Domitian requires people to worship Caesar. And so that's what's going on in 1 John 5, verse 21. Stay away from idols. And so Domitian is saying everybody must worship Caesar, and if you don't, then you're going to get punished. And so it's tensions with a synagogue, but also then you have tensions under imperial cult. And so in the Johannine Monograph series, we published the book John's Gospel in New Perspective by Richard Cassidy. And I was coming to that also in my Glasgow thesis. I think you have tensions with Roman imperial cult, which is why the Johannine Christ hymn is saying Jesus is Son of God, not Julius Caesar, not Caesar Augustus, not Nero, and not Domitian. Okay, so Son of God is highly political. It's not just religious.
Yeah.
And
thank you for saying that, because
this is a fact. This is a fact. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I say this, Paul? Is because I mean, I am a Christian. Okay, I'm putting my cards on the table. But I've been taught to be very critical about religion, my faith, and there's nothing wrong about that.
Sure.
People who is more, extremely conservative, fundamentalist, whatever, they disagree because they have that kind of view about Bible, faith, and whatever. Okay, so when you say it's political, yeah. It is political, and I have no issues with that. I think, I mean, the context that wherein the historical Jesus was moving and his apostles and the whole landscape, there is a political situation going on at the moment. How can you not take that into account when you're talking about the historical Jesus?
Yeah.
There's a book. I'm pretty sure you are aware of that book. I think it's the Son of God, but in the Son of God as a political figure. I'm just, the name of the author. It's just, I don't have it right now. It escapes me right now. But yeah, it's a political thing. There is a political intention or a dig or whatever. But yeah, in many people, we modern people, sometimes when we hear this kind of statements, we kind of like cringe from that because oh no, the Bible has nothing to do with politics. This is only holy, and no, it has to do because that was the real thing going on at the moment. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a political thing.
And I have an essay I can link to you, which is on
Please do.
the Christ hymns. So Colossians 1, 15 to 20, Philippians 2, 5 or 6 to 11, and Hebrews 1, 1 to 4, and then the Johannine Christ hymn. These are all political. And
Yeah.
the whole point is that they're Jewish. The Jewish Messiah, whom the Romans killed, is actually the Son of God, not the divine Julius.
Exactly.
God has raised him from the dead. Stick that in your political theology. And that's one of the reasons why this is so attractive,
Exactly.
even among Jewish people as well as Gentiles, because it's saying, yes, this is the way the God of Israel fights. You look at Isaiah 53, paradoxically, by his stripes we are healed in later generations. And so they're saying that, and then that might go back to Jesus' own self-understanding. If boy Jesus is seeing people crucified by the Syrians and the Romans during his childhood, but yet God is not thwarted. God brings about new possibilities even after the imperial onslaught. Maybe Jesus identified with Isaiah 53 as a child, even, let alone Peter and Paul and others associating that. So anyway, so religion was always political in the first century.
Yes, exactly. Politics was religion. Religion was politics.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let's move on, Paul, on the third question right here. Let me show it to you on the screen. So, what kind of criticism has this project faced along the years, and how have you dealt with them?
Yes. Well, let me just back up a little bit. And so volumes 4, 5, and 6 are on Jesus Remembered in the Johannine tradition. And so early, middle, late. And we have 35 essays that show how Jesus is remembered in Palestine. And so with the Samaritans and the Baptists and Judeans and whatever, maybe an early aposynagogos with Jonathan Bernier instead of later. And then we have middle, which is dialogue with Jewish synagogues and also with Roman imperial cult. And then late, from 85 to 100, in dialogue with antichrists who are docetizing. If Jesus didn't suffer, we don't have to suffer. And so those who deny the flesh of Jesus are not Gnostics in 1 John 4, 1 to 3, and 2 John 7. They deny the flesh. Gnosticism happens later, and this is a total mistake of Johannine scholars. Because while Gnostics were docetizing a non-fleshly Jesus, it doesn't mean that all docetizers, Jesus didn't suffer, were all Gnostics. The reason they denied the humanity of Jesus and his suffering is cheap grace, easy discipleship. Jesus didn't suffer, so it's okay to worship Caesar, to say Caesar is Lord, to offer incense, to deny Christ. And when you look at the correspondence between Pliny and Trajan around 112, then people are brought up. Excuse me.
No, not problem.
When you look at the correspondence between Pliny and Trajan, people are denying Jesus is the Christ and worshiping Caesar. And they said, we've been doing this for 2 decades, back to Domitian's reign. Okay. We're not Christians. We just meet with those people on a day of the week before dawn, singing, eating common food, table fellowship, and singing a hymn to Christ as though he were God. But it's no big deal. We're happy to worship Caesar and to say Caesar is Lord and to offer incense to your idol. And then even the governor says, these people are innocent. They cannot be Christians. Okay. So that's what's going on with the false teachers. They are teaching easy assimilation. They're teaching it's okay to worship Caesar, go to the festivals, go to the gladiatory, the gladiator games. It's okay to march in the parades, to wear
Yeah.
garlands, especially young men and women, and that kind of a thing. You don't have to be all that Jewish. It's okay to worship Caesar, and that's why the first group have left John's church. So the anti-Christic crises in First John are two groups, not one group. And so Raymond Brown on that is wrong. It's not the schismatics who deny the flesh of Jesus. The schismatics leave and go back to the synagogue because they're offended by the liberals.
There you go.
It's okay to go to the festivals, and so you must.
That's fine.
You must love one another. Stop offending our conservative friends with your liberalism. Look, you've caused them to leave. We must love one another. And so just say no to the empirical. By the way, that's the death producing sin. And so, in contrast to the Catholic Church, there's 7 deadly sins. No, there's one deadly sin, and that's worshiping Caesar. And you're also, by denying Jesus and his suffering, by denying the way of the cross, you're also offending brothers and sisters who have just left our church and gone back to the synagogue. So that's what I think is going on. Okay, so these essays then, and so early, middle, late, and then we did post-Johannine essays, Orthodox, and then not so Orthodox. So what we see here is that Jesus is remembered, historical Jesus, in each of these periods, not just one. Volume 5 now, we'll look at Jesus remembered within the tradition. So early, middle, late, or oral tradition into written tradition. And so we have the tradition developed. Volume 6, so that's under review right now. I hope it comes out later this year, 2025. Early
Sure.
Christianity series. And then volume 6, and I'm gathering these essays currently, is on Jesus remembered among the Gospels. So John and Mark, John and Luke, John and Matthew, John and Q. What do we get in corroborative impression? So that will come out in 2026. Then volume 7, almost done here. Volume 7 is methodologies for conducting Johannine historicity. So ancient, modern, postmodern ways of doing historiography. Now, what was your third question?
Yeah. Well, actually, the third question is, what kind of criticism has this project, JJH, faced along the years, and how have you dealt with them?
Well,
As you know, every scholarly enterprise is open to be criticized because that's how true scholarship works.
Yeah.
So perhaps talking about blind spots that you haven't seen or your partners, this has to be evaluated, criticized, but it has to be in a very informed, scholarly way. So what kind of criticism have you guys faced?
yeah, some criticism. I mean, I'm happy to welcome all criticism. Just show me the particular.
Yeah.
But several criticisms that are flawed and fallacious.
Yeah.
Somebody
I know
might
some.
somebody might disagree with me or something that I said, and therefore the whole project is debunked. Like once a scholar might say, "Well, I don't know about a bioptic hypothesis. I might disagree with Anderson. Therefore, the whole JJH project is no good." Well, come on now. I mean, this
Yeah.
is my view. What's your view? Okay, but we've also invited people who totally disagree with us, or who say that John is dependent on Mark. And yeah, go ahead and argue it. I don't think John's dependent on Mark, but put your stuff out there. A second criticism is somebody who might say, well, Anderson's view on interfluentiality. Was there any dialogue between oral traditions underlying Mark and John? Totally bogus. Therefore, there's nothing in the Historical Jesus Project. Well, that's just one of my ideas, but I'm citing Raymond Brown here. What do you do with the fact that little details between Mark and John, like 200 denarii, 300 denarii, they're not picked up on by Matthew and Luke, or green grass, much grass? Well, yeah, okay. If when Matthew and Luke, and this goes back to Christology of the fourth gospel, if you haven't read my Christology of the fourth gospel, and you haven't read the fourth gospel on the quest for Jesus, don't claim that you know what I'm saying.
Exactly.
Read what I've written. Read the footnotes. Okay, uh, and I may be wrong, but if you haven't done your homework, don't say that I'm totally bogus. Read the evidence, and read the problems, and come up with a better solution. So when you look at Matthew and Luke and their uses of Mark, they tend to leave out details, they leave out names, leave out places. They will add units of material. So here we have a lot of details between John and Mark that aren't used in Matthew and Luke. Well, might that suggest if that's not the way written tradition use happened back then among the synoptics, why would you say that John depends on Mark or that Mark depends on John? More plausible, maybe we have oral tradition, or like if two preachers are preaching in ministry together, and Acts 3-8, Peter and John are preaching in ministry. I mean, whether or not they were a part of gospel traditions, we have preachers traveling ministry together, maybe the buzzwords stick. So it's oral tradition, possible contact. Now, here Raymond Brown called it cross influence between the early Mark and early Johannine traditions. I just call it interfluence. Notice you cannot say John depended on Mark if it's oral tradition. How about Mark depending on John? Or just, buzzwords sticking between oral traditions. Furthermore, a lot of the quip sayings in John and Mark, and these are picked up on by Matthew and Luke, some of them. So you have pick up your mat and walk. Well, in Mark, that's in Capernaum. In John, it's in Jerusalem. So Jesus might have said that, but it's in different places. So you can't say, oh, contact with John, therefore John is depending on Mark. No, it's in Jerusalem, not in Capernaum. So again, it could go back to the historical Jesus, or maybe buzzwords floating and sticking. Another one, let us depart. You have in the upper room, or in the Last Supper in John. In Mark, it's in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, it's two different places, although it's a similar quip saying. So I think if there's some contact, you cannot say it's text dependency. So maybe something more fluid. Like another criticism, and I'll cite Paul Foster at Edinburgh, and I haven't responded to his essay over 10 years ago, but he says, oh, there's oral tradition research, it's totally bogus, including John Jesus in history, and of course, obviously Anderson's work. Well, he hasn't. Well, he hasn't read.
Really?
Okay, so in his critique, never once does he cite in his critique of the fourth gospel and the quest for Jesus. He doesn't quote he doesn't reference my footnotes, where I go back to the Christology of the fourth gospel. I mentioned Christology in 19 footnotes in my second book, but he argues that Anderson is totally wrong because Rudolf Bultmann stands, Sitzum-Leben tradition stands. I overturned Bultmann's theory. You have Sitzum-Leben as a basis for different sources underlying John is totally bogus. There's no evidence for it. and so Paul Foster has not done his homework to understand the bases for which I'm calling for a dialectical approach to the gospel. So those are just some of the ways, or like somebody might say, in my seeing the Johannine writings, I personally think that the letters to the churches in Revelation echo the crises in the epistles of John and also the gospel. And so a scholar might say, oh, well, Revelation's different. Of course it's different. But it also echoes Asia Minor Christianity in the larger Johannine situation. So scholars who will pick on one particular issue and therefore say the whole project is bogus, well, that is not responsible scholarship. Do your homework.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, that's one main principle that we all need to take very seriously. If you're going to criticize someone's work, you need to do your work. You need to read through it. The material is not all about just, I mean, you can disagree, but it has to be an informed, uh, at least informed disagreement. Why you don't agree, why you take a different position or a different route. You need to start. I think that's what journals do, in some sense. You need to put out your stuff out there in a, as the late Larry Hurtado used to say, there are many people out there who are self-authenticating themselves by putting the things in internet not being peer reviewed.
Yeah. Now, of course, Revelation is the most different, and so
Yeah.
obviously the author writes in very different ways than do the authors of the Gospel and the epistles of John. So I'm not making a claim for the same authorship, although but you cannot divorce it from the Johannine situation. Even geographically, we have some similarities there. So that's my larger point, is not one of authorship.
Okay. Let's go with the fourth question, Paul. Since this volume deals with historical matters, can you tell us how our modern concept of history differentiates from that of those ancient authors, such as the writer of the Gospel of John?
Yes, and I think that
Because let me just say this before. I mean, history, the way we modern people understand it, is has to be this way: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that following that pattern. If it doesn't, it never happens.
yeah, and here I think that biblical historians or critics of biblical history
Yeah.
operate very differently from other historiographers. So they will be reductionistic, trying to make no mistakes. And so here's a fallacy that biblical historians or Jesus historians tend to make. They will say, not necessarily, because there's a problem with a view, that equals necessarily not. And so I'm saying, no, wait a minute. You might challenge positivistically verification. Unless we positively know it's true, we can't affirm it as true. Have you also challenged positivity of falsification? How do you show me it's not true? And of course, it's impossible to know that something never happened. Okay.
Yeah.
So what we have is imbalanced positivism. And so a fallacy. And so what scholars need to do is to question things, but to be more agnostic about what you claim cannot have happened. So, of course, miracles are problematic, but you can't say that there were no healers during the days of Jesus. I mean, the Jesus seminar showed that we have healers like Jesus during his day. Or you have Apollonius of Tyana, who was experienced as a miracle worker in Asia Minor. Maybe he got his ideas from the Gospels. Okay. But to say that, therefore, nothing happened in his own heroic work, and therefore all the Gospels are mythologies constructed around a God man typology. Well, I mean, how do you know that? I mean, maybe memories of him developed because of gospel stories. And so you have things that are problematic, but that's different from saying we know that something can't happen. Now, miracles obviously are problematic in terms of historiography. And so anytime somebody says, hey, this happened and therefore God did it. Okay, so like you have a football game. I want to thank Jesus for helping us win the game. Well, the quarterback was also really good. And you might have a cause and effect explanation
Yeah.
for how a really good football team like the Philadelphia Eagles and their amazing defensive line
Why the Eagles?
made it impossible for the Chiefs to win, even though they have a great quarterback and a great winning history. Why? Yes, they had a really good team, and the quarterback just could not get around the rush. Now, somebody might say, I want to thank Jesus, I want to thank God for that victory, but the cause and effect relationship is that you have a really good team that beat another team fair and square.
Yeah.
So just because somebody says, well, Jesus, I mean, he wasn't the only healer back then. He wasn't the only exorcist. Or sometimes the waves calm down, you see. And so, yeah, you have problematic, or maybe even with turning water into wine, maybe we have the addition of Dionysius cult, water into wine mythology. Maybe we have that added to a wedding event or something like that. But that doesn't mean that Jesus never did anything at a wedding. Okay, and so maybe you have glomming on of miracle associations, or Jesus really is a prophet like Moses. Moses did miracles back then. Therefore, Jesus is a Jewish Messiah like Moses and Elijah. Elijah fed the multitude. So does Jesus. Elijah. Elisha raised the woman's son, therefore Jesus. So yeah, you have heroes in Hebrew scripture and in culture glomming onto Jesus, but that's not to say that Jesus never did any healings. And so we just have to have a more critical analysis of critical hegemony in terms of what cannot be historical.
All right. Thank you for that. And last but not least, Paul, I think you have addressed this before, but you can go ahead and tell us, because we need to know what's in the hopper. So
Yeah.
to conclude, tell us about your forthcoming book.
Yeah.
What should we expect from it?
Yeah, thank you. Well, two of my books that are in press right now. One is my own theory.
You've been busy.
Yeah. One is pulling together some of my essays, my own overall Johannine theory. It's
Okay.
the dialogical autonomy of the fourth gospel. And the great Johannine scholars, not that I'm claiming to be one, but these are my
I
heroes.
think you are.
Well,
my personal opinion.
Oh, well, you have very wonderful judgment. Okay, I have published over 100 Johannine essays, and I have written or edited over 20 Johannine books. Okay, and I'm in the process of writing a few more Johannine books and a few more essays. So my overall Johannine theory, though, is going to be published with Cascade Books. And so here I'm pulling together a bioptic hypothesis and John's relation to Mark, and you have Jesus as prophet like Moses in the fourth gospel, the father-son relationship, Deuteronomy 18. Sure. And then you have also aspects of historicity and archaeology in the Gospel of John. So these essays are going to come together with Cascade Books, and that's my overall theory and a bioptic hypothesis. Then I have a book that Ehrman's will publish, I believe, in 2026, which is Jesus in Johannine Perspective, A Fourth Quest for Jesus. And this is a lecture that I gave at the South Africa Theological Seminary 4 years ago. And also I lectured around the UK at Cambridge, Glasgow, Aberdeen, St. Andrews, Durham, and then down at Oxford. And actually the lecture was received pretty well. And so this is called Jesus in Johannine Perspective, Inviting a Fourth Quest for Jesus. And so I'll begin with reasons for excluding John. Then here's John's dialogical autonomy. And then here are new criteria for determining historicity. So Jesus in Johannine Perspective, using John and the synoptics, using these four new criteria, which are John's dialogical autonomy and John's critical realism. And then you have primitivity versus embarrassment or criterion of dissimilarity, and then a new inclusive approach to seeing John and the synoptics in terms of understanding the larger picture. It'll conclude with a final chapter, which is where I say, here's where the Jesus of history is brought to us by John and the synoptics, not just the synoptics alone. And so, again, the first three quests, including the third quest, and to some degree, the new quest, because as I looked through their approach, okay, they are challenging the periodization of quests. And I do agree with Dale Allison that we have in America books on the historical Jesus written every year, even after Schweitzer's, no quest. Good point. But in Germany, things really do pick up with Käsemann. And I think that is a second quest or a new quest. And I think with Tom Wright, we do have social sciences methodologies, the works of my own doctoral dissertation supervisor, John Riches, Jesus and the Transformation of Judaism. I think he is correct in going with Mary Douglas and religious anthropology. Jesus history is challenging religious purity laws in the name of a more open relationship with God based on love. He's trying to transform Judaism, not set up a new religion. I think that goes back to Reimarus. And so I appreciate what the next quest is doing in terms of saying, let's expand that and do political, sociological, socioeconomic analyses. But they also tend to leave out the Gospel of John. So I might say there's still probably a third quest, even though I think the work is really important. The question.
But you did. Sorry that I'm breaking here before I forget about this. But you did a contribution on the new quest, the new book edited by James Crossley and Chris Kiff.
No,
they didn't.
No, they did not ask me to include an essay.
That's interesting.
And I think the book is really good. I just got a review copy, and so
okay,
and so I will benefit from the good scholarship.
Yeah,
but I'm noticing that none of their essays are including the Gospel of John.
No, I was going through because I had I did correspondence with James Crossley and Chris Kiff. Unfortunately, due to schedule issues, we're not able to come to the interview. But I was able to read through the table of contents, and I don't remember seeing the Gospel of John essay or something like that.
Yeah.
So well.
So anyway, but in my view, let's benefit from it.
Okay.
I really love the work of Robin Walsh and of Crossley and others. So let's see how this contributes to our understanding of Jesus, and then and then I mean, what I might do is say, okay, what do we see in this new book and the work that they're doing, and how does that relate to the Gospel of John?
Exactly.
Or John's presentation of Jesus. Now, what I also will say is that sometimes they are the next quest or Jesus scholars are proceeding without any benefiting from JJH. So as I look in the table of contents, only one scholar has included anything from the John Jesus and History Project. And also nobody is really citing my work at all, which is fine. But
but that made you wonder why not?
Well, if you're going to include everything, how can you not include Johannine scholars in the quest? So I think the next quest is maybe phase 2 of the third quest. And now here's why I'm putting the third quest at least demanding a fourth quest, because scholars play it safe. They don't want their essays or books to be rejected. And so it's too risky to include the Gospel of John. And even a great scholar like Tom Wright. And I just had a lovely, he came and spoke here in Oregon last week. Great seeing him again. But Tom is, playing it safe and saying, I'm dealing with Paul and Jesus, but historical Jesus and John, well, I'll leave that to other people. Because you get into the Johannine synoptic thing, you get into Johannine composition, you get into authorship, you get into early death of the beloved disciple, which is totally bogus. John did not die early. The fifth and eighth and the 5th and 9th century authors who are claimed by De Boer to say that John died early, they both say that this is Philip Sidetes and George Hamartalos. They say John the Apostle died in Ephesus after the mission. And so a whole reason for excluding John from historical Jesus research, because the evangelist died early, it's an embarrassment to critical scholarship. Nobody will leave that until 1888, De Boer, and he was wrong. So anyway, we need to have second criticality, critical appraisals of critical views. And I'm also happy to benefit from all good scholarship, and just to also to ask what does, okay, so your earlier question though, ancient historiography, what can we learn from that? And this is going to be in volume 7, good essay by Beth Shepard and Harry Attridge and others. And then modern scholarship, so the 19th century exclusion of John and those quests and Strauss and everybody else. But then also, how about postmodern historiographers? How about Ricoeur? How about Gadamer? How about Polanyi? How about Hayden White? Whose history are we talking about? So when you look at historiographers over the last, 2/3 of a century, and use their approaches to what is historical and what is not necessarily historical, that's going to include the Gospel of John instead of excluding it, like 19th century dogmatic historicism.
Okay, so Paul, we have come to the end. This is the sad part of doing interviews. It has to come to an end. I wish it wouldn't. But I just want to thank you for your time, and thank you for addressing our questions today. And everybody out there, you need to go and get the most recent book, which is on the screen, John, Jesus, and History, Volume 4. Jesus, remember, in that Johannine situation. So go get the book and get yourself a big dive into Johannine studies and the historical Jesus, because John does matter. Paul, final comments. Let us know, please, before we go.
Yeah, thank you, Marv. Again, you shall know the truth will set you free.
Exactly.
I think that's a promise also of good academics. And so, I'd be happy to know that there's nothing historical about anything in the Bible. Show me you know that. But just to challenge something does not prove that an alternative is true. To challenge X does not prove Y. And so unless you have a better proof of Y, then yeah, you're challenging X, but show me you know what a better view is. And the fact is that followers of Jesus changed the world. In the 2nd century, John the Apostle is the most frequently cited apostolic figure, more than anybody else other than Jesus.
Oh.
And so to say that we know that he didn't do anything, the one question is whether John the Elder is the same as John the Apostle. That's the one question. And people say there were 2 Johns buried at Ephesus. One's the Apostle, one's the Elder. Well, yeah, that's fine. I think that John the Elder, now here I'm going to agree with Bultmann and also with Martin Hengel, that John the Elder may be the final redactor or someone like that. Now, Bultmann doesn't say it. He says an ecclesial redactor and the author of 1 John was an ecclesial person. So I'm happy to see John the Elder as finalizing the witness of somebody else after his death. But you cannot say that we know that this was not someone like John the Apostle.
Yeah.
And I'd be glad to know that it's Lazarus, but Lazarus is never associated with Peter. I'd be glad to know that it's Mary Magdalene. Jesus loved Mary and Martha. Maybe it's Mary or Martha.
Imagine a woman being the author of the gospel. Wow.
Well, I'd like to know that. That fits in with my own feminist ecclesiology.
Yeah, I know.
But you don't have Mary, any of the Marys or Martha associated with Peter, like you do John the Apostle. I'd be happy to know that it's James, the son of Zebedee, but James died in 44, so it can't be him. So anyway, I'd be glad to know that it's Thomas. That's the view of James Charlesworth and his whole book on the beloved disciple. But the beloved disciple believed in John 20, but Thomas yet had not believed in later John 20. And so that doesn't work. Okay. But I love and I love Johnson Thomas Guti's work of Thomas in India. And I'd love to know that there's no historical figure here, that it's simply embellished, because John the Apostle is embellished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but that doesn't mean that he was an historical figure. So anyway, people take one view and therefore say and challenge it and say it proves another view. No, show me that the alternative is historically more plausible. Until you do that, you haven't really overturned the previous one.
Yeah, there you have it, people. So again, thank you. I just want to remind you of the following interviews that we have in schedule. We have Dr. Tremper Lohman III coming on to the show to talk about the Genesis. Yes, Genesis in its ancient Near Eastern context, which is going to be on the next week. And following that interview, we have the one and only John J. Collins coming to the show to talk about his most recent book that was translated into Spanish, which is the Apocalyptic Imagination. Big book. We need to know more about that. So we're going to be talking about with Dr. John J. Collins and asking a lot of questions as much as we can, just like we do with Paul right now. So Paul, again, thank you so much for your time. Remember, this is a platform for you as scholars. We need to come and bring all the views for and against. And I just want to thank you for your time, and we hope to see you again on this platform.
Gracias y te lo agradezco mucho. Thanks so much.
Gracias por decirlo en español. Gracias.
Sí.
Everybody, until the next time. Bye now.